The morning sun had barely risen over the rocky terrain when Sarah Miller checked her equipment one last time. She was a communications specialist with the military unit stationed near the border, and today's mission was supposed to be routine. Her team of 12 soldiers was tasked with establishing a temporary observation post in the mountains, a job they had done countless times before. Sarah was 28 years old with 5 years of service under her belt. She had joined the military right after college, driven by a desire to serve her country and prove to herself that she was capable of more than anyone expected. Growing up in a small town in Montana, she had always been the quiet one, the girl who preferred books to parties. But the military had changed her. It had given her confidence, purpose, and a family in the form of her fellow soldiers. As the convoy moved through the winding mountain roads, Sarah sat in the third vehicle, her radio equipment beside her. The air was crisp and cold, typical for this time of year in the highlands. She looked around at her teammates. There was Lieutenant Marcus Chen, their unit commander, a man known for his calm demeanor and strategic thinking. Beside him sat Corporal Jake Thompson, the youngest member of their team at just 22, always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. In the vehicle ahead were Sergeant Maria Rodriguez and Private David Walsh, both experienced soldiers who had served multiple tours. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles, each carrying soldiers and equipment needed to set up the observation post. The mission was expected to take 3 days. They would establish the post, conduct surveillance of the area, and then rotate out with another team. It was standard procedure, nothing that should cause any concern. Sarah adjusted her headset and ran through her communication protocols. She had to maintain contact with the base, relay information from the observation post, and ensure all team members could communicate with each other. It was a responsibility she took seriously. In combat situations, communication could mean the difference between life and death. The road began to climb steeply, and the vehicles slowed to navigate the tight turns. Sarah noticed how quiet everyone had become. It was that pre-mission focus where each person retreated into their own thoughts, mentally preparing for the work ahead. She took a deep breath and looked out the window at the rugged landscape. The mountains were beautiful in their harsh way, all stone and scrub brush with patches of snow still clinging to the shadowed areas. Suddenly, the lead vehicle came to a stop. Lieutenant Chen's voice crackled over the radio, asking for a status report. The driver of the first vehicle responded that there was debris on the road ahead, possibly from a recent rock slide. They would need to clear it before proceeding. It was a minor delay, nothing unusual in this terrain. Sarah watched as several soldiers dismounted to assess the situation. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking the area for any threats before beginning to clear the rocks from the path. Everything seemed normal. The sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the mountainside. Birds called from somewhere in the distance. It was peaceful, almost serene, but then everything changed in an instant. The explosion was deafening, a massive blast that lifted the lead vehicle into the air and sent it crashing onto its side. The force of it shook the ground, and Sarah felt her own vehicle lurch. Her ears rang from the noise, and for a moment she couldn't process what had happened. Then training kicked in. The radio exploded with voices, everyone shouting at once. Sarah forced herself to focus, to cut through the chaos and understand the situation. The lead vehicle had hit an improvised explosive device, a hidden bomb buried in the road. The rock slide had been a trap, designed to make them stop at exactly the right spot. Now they were under attack. Gunfire erupted from the hills above them. The enemy had been waiting, hidden among the rocks, and now they opened fire on the convoy. Bullets pinged off the armored vehicles, and Sarah ducked instinctively. Lieutenant Chen was shouting orders, directing the team to return fire and take defensive positions. The driver of Sarah's vehicle gunned the engine, moving them to better cover. Sarah's hands moved automatically, switching radio frequencies, trying to establish contact with the base. They needed support, needed backup and medical evacuation for the wounded. Her voice was steady as she transmitted their position and situation, even though her heart was pounding. She could hear the fear in other voices on the radio, could feel it in herself, but she pushed it down. There would be time for fear later. Right now, people were depending on her. Through the window, she could see the overturned lead vehicle. Smoke was pouring from it, and she couldn't tell if anyone inside was moving. Her stomach clenched with worry. Maria and David had been in that vehicle, along with 2 other soldiers. She had to know if they were okay, but she couldn't leave her post, not yet. First, she had to make sure help was coming. The base responded to her transmission, confirming they had received the distress call. Air support was being scrambled, and a quick reaction force was being mobilized. But it would take time for them to arrive. The team was on their own for now, fighting for their lives on a remote mountain road, with wounded comrades and an enemy that had them pinned down. Sarah looked at the equipment beside her, at the radio that was her lifeline to the outside world. She looked at her fellow soldiers returning fire, defending their position with everything they had. And she knew that the next few hours would test them all in ways they had never been tested before. This was no longer a routine mission. This was survival. The firefight had been going on for 20 minutes, though it felt like hours to Sarah. Every second stretched out, filled with the crack of gunfire and the shouts of her teammates. She maintained her position in the vehicle, coordinating communications while bullets struck the armored exterior. Her fingers worked the radio controls with mechanical precision, updating the base on their situation, relaying tactical information between team members who were spread across the ambush site. Lieutenant Chen had organized a defensive perimeter, using the remaining 3 vehicles as cover. Half the team returned fire at the enemy positions in the hills, while the others tried to reach the overturned lead vehicle. But every attempt was driven back by intense gunfire. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well, with clear lines of fire down to the road and plenty of cover for themselves. Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from Corporal Jake Thompson. His voice was tight with stress. He had managed to get close enough to the damaged vehicle to see inside, and what he reported made Sarah's blood run cold. There were survivors, but they were trapped. The vehicle had rolled when the bomb exploded and the doors were jammed. Worse, he could see fire starting to spread from the engine compartment. If they didn't get those people out soon, they would burn alive. She immediately relayed this information to Lieutenant Chen and to the base. The quick reaction force was still 30 minutes out. Air support was 20 minutes away. They didn't have that kind of time. Someone had to reach that vehicle now, and someone had to get those doors open. But the enemy fire was too heavy. Anyone who broke cover would be cut down before they made it 10 feet. Sarah looked at her equipment, at the radio setup she was responsible for maintaining. Then she looked at the overturned vehicle, at the smoke that was growing thicker by the moment. She had joined the military to serve, to help people. Right now, her teammates needed help, and she was the only one in a position to provide it. Her radio equipment was important, but it could wait. Lev's could not. She grabbed her weapon and a medical kit, then keyed her radio one more time. She told the base what she was about to do, and asked them to keep the channel open. Then she told Lieutenant Chen. He immediately ordered her to stay put, said they would find another way. But Sarah knew there was no other way. Every second of delay meant more fire, more smoke, more danger for the people trapped in that vehicle. Before anyone could stop her, she pushed open the door and ran. The distance to the overturned vehicle was about 40 yards, all of it exposed to enemy fire. She ran in a crouch, zigzagging to make herself a harder target, just like she had been taught in training. Behind her, she could hear Lieutenant Chen shouting, and then the volume of return fire from her team increased dramatically. They were laying down covering fire, trying to keep the enemy's heads down while she made her desperate sprint. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. She heard them crack past her head, felt the wind of their passage. Her lungs burned, her legs pumped, and every instinct screamed at her to find cover. But she kept running, kept moving toward that smoking vehicle. She thought about the people inside, about Maria and David and the others. They were her family. She would not abandon them. She dove the last few feet, sliding into cover behind the overturned vehicle. Her shoulder hit hard and she felt something pop, a sharp pain that made her gasp. But there was no time to worry about that. She could hear voices from inside the vehicle now, weak calls for help. She crawled to the door, found it twisted and jammed shut. The frame had buckled in the roll, and the door was caught in the crushed metal. Sarah looked around frantically for something to use as a lever. She found a piece of metal from the vehicle's armor that had been torn loose in the explosion. It was heavy and awkward, but she wedged it into the gap and pulled with all her strength. Her injured shoulder screamed in protest, but she ignored it. The door groaned, shifted slightly. She repositioned her makeshift lever and pulled again. More movement. One more try, and the door came free with a shriek of tortured metal. Smoke poured out thick and black. Sarah pulled her shirt up over her mouth and nose and peered inside. She could see two people clearly. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was in the back, conscious but pinned by debris. Private David Walsh was in the front passenger seat, slumped over and bleeding from a head wound. There were two others, the driver and another soldier, but Sarah couldn't see them clearly through the smoke. Maria saw her and reached out a hand. Her face was covered in blood from a cut on her forehead, but her eyes were alert. She told Sarah to get David first, that he was hurt worst. Sarah nodded and climbed into the vehicle, ignoring the heat, ignoring the smoke that burned her lungs. She reached David and checked his pulse. It was there, weak but steady. She got her arms under him and started to pull him free. It was harder than she expected. David was bigger than her, and the confined space made it difficult to maneuver. Her injured shoulder made everything worse, sending jolts of agony through her body with every movement. But she set her jaw and kept pulling, kept fighting to get him out. Finally, she had him clear of the vehicle. She dragged him around to the far side, away from the enemy fire, and laid him down as gently as she could. She did a quick check of his injuries. The head wound looked bad, bleeding heavily, but head wounds always bled a lot. She pulled out a bandage from her medical kit and wrapped it around his head, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. He was unconscious but breathing. He would live if they could get him out of here. Then she went back for Maria. The smoke was worse now, much worse. The fire had spread and Sarah could feel the heat of it on her skin. Maria was coughing hard, her face pale. Sarah tried to lift the debris that was pinning her legs, but it was too heavy. She braced her feet and pulled, using her legs instead of her damaged shoulder. The metal shifted and Maria was able to pull herself free. Together they crawled out of the vehicle. As soon as they were clear, Sarah heard a sound that made her look up. An enemy fighter had worked his way down from the hills and was approaching their position, weapon raised. Time seemed to slow. Sarah saw him, saw his gun coming up, saw his finger on the trigger. She didn't think. She just moved, throwing herself in front of Maria, bringing her own weapon up. The shots came almost simultaneously. Sarah felt impacts, felt the sledgehammer blows to her chest and leg. Her body armor stopped the chest shots, but the leg shot went clean through her thigh. She went down hard, but not before her own shots found their target. The enemy fighter fell and did not move again. Maria was screaming Sarah's name. Lieutenant Chen and Jake were suddenly there, dragging both of them to better cover. Sarah looked down at her leg and saw blood, a lot of it. The pain hit a moment later, white-hot and overwhelming. Her vision started to gray at the edges. But through the pain, through the shock, she felt something else. Relief. Maria was safe. David was safe. She had done what she came to do. Sarah's world had narrowed to a tunnel of pain and determination. Lieutenant Chen had applied a tourniquet to her leg, stopping the worst of the bleeding, but she could feel herself weakening. Her shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, and breathing hurt where the bullets had impacted her body armor. She knew she probably had broken ribs beneath the vest. But none of that mattered right now because they were still in the fight, still under fire, and still waiting for help to arrive. Jake was beside her, his young face tight with worry. He kept telling her to stay still, to conserve her strength. But Sarah couldn't stay still. She could hear the radio chatter, could hear the confusion in the voices of her teammates. Without someone coordinating communications, they were losing their tactical advantage. Information wasn't getting where it needed to go. The quick reaction force was trying to reach them, but they needed precise updates on the enemy positions and the team's status. She grabbed Jake's arm and told him to get her radio equipment. He started to protest, saying she needed to rest, that she had done enough. But she cut him off with a look that left no room for argument. She was still the communications specialist for this unit, and she still had a job to do. Injured or not, bleeding or not, she would do that job until someone relieved her or she physically could not continue. Jake ran back to the vehicle where her equipment was stored, keeping low to avoid the ongoing gunfire. The intensity of the enemy attack had decreased somewhat after air support had been called in, but they were still pinned down. The fighters in the hills knew that help was coming for the soldiers below, and they were determined to inflict as much damage as possible before they had to retreat. When Jake returned with the radio pack, Sarah propped herself up against the wheel of the overturned vehicle. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body, but she gritted her teeth and powered through it. She settled the headset over her ears and began working the controls with hands that shook slightly from blood loss and shock. Her training took over, muscle memory guiding her fingers even as her vision swam. The first thing she did was establish contact with the incoming quick reaction force. They were 15 minutes out now, approaching fast on the same road the original convoy had taken. Sarah warned them about the ambush site, advised them on the best approach to avoid additional traps. Then she switched frequencies and coordinated with the air support that was circling overhead. The helicopter gunships needed precise coordinates for the enemy positions, and Sarah worked with Lieutenant Chen to provide them. Maria crawled over to sit beside her. The sergeant's face was still bloody, but her eyes were clear and focused. She told Sarah she was the bravest person she had ever known, that what she had done was beyond heroic. Sarah tried to wave off the compliment, but Maria wouldn't let her. She insisted that Sarah had saved her life and David's life, had risked everything when no one would have blamed her for staying in cover. Sarah just shook her head. She told Maria that's what family does. They take care of each other. When someone is in trouble, you don't calculate the odds or think about the risk. You just act. She had never been the strongest soldier or the fastest or the best shot. But she could do this. She could be the person who ran toward danger when others needed her. That was enough. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, and moments later the gunships swept over the ambush site. Their weapons opened up on the enemy positions, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The concentrated fire from above forced the fighters to abandon their positions and flee. Some tried to make a stand, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, the immediate threat was neutralized. The quick reaction force arrived shortly after, their vehicles rolling up with soldiers ready for combat. But the fight was over. The enemy had scattered, melting back into the mountains from which they had come. Now it was time for rescue and recovery. Medics rushed to the wounded, including Sarah. They tried to take the radio from her to get her onto a stretcher, but she refused. Not yet. There were still things that needed to be done. She contacted the base and gave them a full status report. 2 soldiers from the lead vehicle had been killed in the initial explosion. David was critical but stable. Maria had a concussion and various cuts and bruises. Sarah herself had a gunshot wound to the leg, a dislocated shoulder, and suspected broken ribs. The rest of the team had various minor injuries, but nothing life-threatening. The mission was a failure, but they had survived. Most of them, anyway. Only after she had completed her report, only after she had confirmed that everyone else was being taken care of, did Sarah finally let the medics work on her. They eased her onto a stretcher and started an IV to replace lost fluids. One of them, a young woman about Sarah's age, told her she was going into shock and needed to relax. Sarah wanted to laugh at that. Relax. As if she could just turn off everything she was feeling, all the adrenaline and pain and grief for the fallen. As they loaded her into a medical evacuation helicopter, Sarah looked back at the ambush site. The overturned vehicle was still smoking, a testament to how close they had all come to dying. She could see her teammates, see them helping each other, supporting each other. That's what made them strong. Not their weapons or their training or their equipment. Each other. The bonds they had formed, the trust they had built. That was what allowed them to survive when everything went wrong. The helicopter lifted off, and Sarah felt the strange sensation of floating. Her body was exhausted, running on empty, sustained only by willpower and the drugs the medics had given her for the pain. She knew she would be in a hospital soon, would face surgeries and recovery and all the challenges that came with serious injuries. But right now, in this moment, she felt something unexpected. She felt proud. She had been tested in the worst possible way, had faced a situation where death was not just possible but probable, and she had not run. She had not hidden. She had not saved herself at the expense of others. Instead, she had run toward danger, had put her life on the line for her teammates. She had done what she joined the military to do. She had served with honor, with courage, with selflessness. Maria's face appeared above her. The sergeant had insisted on riding in the same helicopter, refusing to be separated from the woman who had saved her life. She held Sarah's hand and told her to stay awake, to keep fighting. Sarah squeezed back weakly and managed to smile. She told Maria not to worry, that she was tougher than she looked. It was something her father used to say, back when she was a kid growing up in Montana. She had always believed him, always trusted that she had that inner strength even when others doubted it. Now she had proved it beyond any doubt. Not just to others, but to herself. She was tougher than she looked. She was braver than she knew. And no matter what happened next, no matter how long the recovery took or what challenges lay ahead, She would face them the same way she had faced this ambush, with courage, with determination, and with the knowledge that she was never truly alone as long as she had her family of soldiers beside her. The military hospital was a blur of white walls and fluorescent lights. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as doctors worked on her injuries. She remembered fragments, the sharp smell of antiseptic, the murmur of medical staff discussing her condition, the distant sound of helicopter rotors as other wounded soldiers arrived. Pain was a constant companion, dulled by medication but never entirely gone. When she finally woke fully, it was to find herself in a recovery ward. Her leg was heavily bandaged and elevated. Her shoulder was immobilized in a sling and her chest was wrapped where her ribs had been broken. An IV drip fed fluids and antibiotics into her arm. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment. Sunlight streamed through a window and Sarah realized she had no idea what day it was or how long she had been unconscious. A nurse noticed she was awake and came over with a warm smile. The woman introduced herself as Lieutenant Patricia Morris and explained that Sarah had been in surgery for several hours. The bullet had damaged muscle and tissue in her thigh, but had miraculously missed all major blood vessels and bones. Her shoulder had been relocated, though she would need physical therapy to regain full range of motion. The broken ribs would heal on their own with rest. Overall, considering what she had been through, she was incredibly lucky. Sarah asked about her teammates. The nurse's smile faltered slightly before she said that Maria Rodriguez and David Walsh were both alive and recovering. David had required brain surgery to relieve swelling from his head injury, but the doctors were optimistic about his prognosis. Maria had been treated for her concussion and released to light duty. The rest of the team had various minor injuries but were all expected to make full recoveries. Then the nurse grew quiet and told Sarah what she already knew in her heart. 2 soldiers had died in the initial explosion. They were good men, both of them, with families waiting at home. The grief hit Sarah hard. She had known them, had served with them. They were part of her extended family, and now they were gone. She turned her face away from the nurse and let the tears come. All the fear and pain and trauma she had been holding back broke free. She cried for the fallen, for the wounded, for the mission that had gone so wrong. She cried for herself too, for the innocence she had lost on that mountain road, for the nightmares she knew would come. Over the next few days, visitors began to arrive. Lieutenant Chen came first, his face grave but his eyes warm with respect. He pulled up a chair beside her bed and told her he had recommended her for a medal, that what she had done went beyond the call of duty. Sarah tried to protest, saying she had only done what anyone would have done, but Chen cut her off. He told her that most people would not have left cover, would not have run through enemy fire, would not have kept working despite their injuries. She had saved lives and maintained unit cohesion during a crisis. That deserved recognition. Jake came next, bringing flowers and an awkward teenage shyness. He told her she was his hero, that he hoped he could be half as brave when the moment came. Sarah laughed despite herself and told him he had already proven his courage. He had been right there beside her, providing covering fire, helping with the wounded. The whole team had worked together, and that was what mattered. Then Maria arrived, and Sarah felt her composure slip again. The sergeant's face was still marked with cuts and bruises, but she was walking and talking and alive. She crossed the room quickly and embraced Sarah carefully, mindful of her injuries. For a long moment, they just held each other. 2 soldiers who had stared death in the face and survived. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes. Maria told her the story of what happened after she was evacuated. The quick reaction force had secured the area and recovered the bodies of the fallen. Engineers had swept the road for additional explosives and found 2 more hidden bombs. If the convoy had continued after the first explosion, more vehicles would have been destroyed. Sarah's quick action in getting on the radio and calling for help had not only saved her immediate teammates but had prevented additional casualties. The sergeant also told her something else. David Walsh had regained consciousness. The doctors said his recovery would take months, maybe years, but he was going to make it. His first words after waking up were to ask about Sarah, to ask if the woman who had pulled him from the burning vehicle was okay. Maria had been able to tell him yes, that Sarah was hurt but alive, and David had cried with relief. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's body began to heal. Physical therapy was grueling. pushing her to regain strength and mobility in her injured leg and shoulder. There were setbacks and moments of frustration when progress seemed impossibly slow, but she kept at it, driven by the same determination that had carried her through the ambush. She would recover. She would get back to full strength, and she would return to duty. But the mental recovery was harder than the physical. Sarah found herself having nightmares, vivid dreams where she was back on that mountain road running through gunfire, pulling at that jammed door while fire and smoke surrounded her. She would wake up gasping, her heart racing, her body covered in sweat. The hospital provided counseling services, and Sarah reluctantly began attending sessions with a therapist who specialized in combat trauma. The therapist, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Ellen Sawyer, helped Sarah understand that what she was experiencing was normal. It was her mind's way of processing the trauma, of trying to make sense of an event that had pushed her beyond all normal human limits. Dr. Sawyer taught her coping techniques, ways to manage the anxiety and fear when they threatened to overwhelm her. She also helped Sarah see that asking for help was not a weakness but a strength, that recognizing she needed support was part of being a good soldier. One afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A general she had never met walked into her room, accompanied by Lieutenant Chen and several other officers. The general introduced himself and told Sarah he had read the reports from the ambush. He spoke of her courage, her dedication, and her selflessness. Then he presented her with the Silver Star, one of the highest military decorations for valor in combat. The medal was pinned to her hospital gown while the other officers saluted. Sarah felt overwhelmed. She had never sought recognition, had never thought of herself as a hero. She was just a communications specialist who had done what needed to be done. But as she looked at the faces around her, at the respect and admiration in their eyes, she began to understand what the medal really represented. It was not just about her actions on that one day. It was about the values she embodied, the standards she upheld. It was about showing others what was possible when ordinary people did extraordinary things. After the ceremony, Lieutenant Chen stayed behind. He told Sarah that the entire unit was proud of her, that her actions had inspired everyone who heard the story. But he also told her something she needed to hear. He said that she did not owe the military her life, that she had already given more than most. If she decided she wanted to leave after her recovery, no one would judge her. She had earned the right to make that choice. Sarah thought about this long after he left. She thought about her future, about what she wanted from life. The military had given her so much, had shaped her into the person she was today, but it had also taken from her. She had scars now, both visible and invisible. She had lost friends. She had seen the worst that humanity had to offer. Could she continue to serve, knowing what it might cost her? The answer was not simple, and Sarah knew she would be wrestling with that question for a long time to come. 3 months had passed since the ambush. Sarah stood in her small apartment testing her weight on her injured leg. The physical therapy had worked wonders, though she still had a slight limp when she was tired. Her shoulder had regained most of its range of motion and her ribs had healed completely. On the outside, she looked like she had mostly recovered. But inside, the healing was more complicated. The nightmares had decreased in frequency but had not stopped entirely. She still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, her sheets soaked with sweat, the sound of gunfire echoing in her ears. Dr. Sawyer had told her this was normal. That trauma recovery was not a straight line, but a journey with ups and downs. Some days Sarah felt strong and capable. Other days, a sudden loud noise would send her heart racing and her hands shaking. She had been cleared for light duty and was working at the base, helping train new communications specialists. It was important work, teaching the next generation of soldiers how to maintain contact under pressure, how to coordinate in crisis situations. But Sarah found herself struggling with the transition. She missed her unit, missed being in the field. Yet at the same time, the thought of returning to combat operations filled her with a dread she could not quite name. Maria came to visit often. The sergeant had been promoted and was now working in a training capacity as well, though she was scheduled to return to active deployment in a few months. They would sit together and talk about everything and nothing, two women who had shared an experience that few could understand. Maria never pushed Sarah to talk about the ambush if she did not want to, but she was always there when Sarah needed to process her feelings. One evening, Maria brought news that hit Sarah hard. David Walsh was being medically retired from the military. His head injury had resulted in permanent cognitive changes that made him unfit for continued service. He would receive full benefits and support, but his military career was over. Sarah felt a complicated mix of relief that he was alive and grief for what he had lost. She asked Maria for his contact information, wanting to reach out, but Maria gently suggested she wait. David was still processing his own trauma and might not be ready for that conversation. Jake also stayed in touch, sending her messages and occasionally stopping by. He had been recommended for promotion based on his actions during the ambush, and he was thriving in his role. But he always made time for Sarah, always checked in to see how she was doing. He told her once that she had shown him what real leadership looked like, that it was not about rank or authority, but about being willing to sacrifice for others. Sarah did not know what to say to that, so she just hugged him and thanked him for being a good friend. The question of her future loomed large in Sarah's mind. She had extended her service contract once already, committing to another term. But that contract would expire in a year, and she needed to decide whether to re-enlist or return to civilian life. The military was all she had known for the past 5 years. It had given her purpose, identity, and a family, but it had also nearly killed her. Could she risk that again? Should she? She talked to her parents about it during a phone call. They were supportive but worried, as parents always are. Her mother said she would support whatever Sarah decided, but admitted she would sleep better at night if Sarah chose a safer path. Her father, a Vietnam veteran himself, understood the pull of military service in a way her mother could not. He told Sarah that only she could make this decision, that she had to listen to her own heart and trust herself. Sarah decided to visit David Walsh, despite Maria's earlier advice to wait. She needed to see him, needed to look into the eyes of the man she had saved and understand what her actions had meant. She drove to the rehabilitation facility where he was living, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her mind full of doubts. What if he blamed her for not getting to him sooner? What if seeing her brought back traumatic memories for him? But when she walked into his room, David's face lit up with joy. He stood slowly from his chair and crossed the room to embrace her. His movements were careful, deliberate, lacking the fluid grace she remembered, but he was there, alive and present, and that was what mattered. They sat together and talked for hours. David told her about his recovery, about the challenges he faced with memory and concentration. He told her about his plans for the future, about the degree he wanted to pursue, about the woman he loved who had stood by him through everything. Then he looked Sarah in the eyes and told her something she would never forget. He said that she had given him a second chance at life, that everything he would do from this moment forward was possible because of her courage. He did not see his medical retirement as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to build a different kind of life. He was grateful, not bitter, and he wanted Sarah to know that her sacrifice had been worth it, that she had made a difference that would echo through time. Sarah left that meeting, with tears on her face but also with something else, clarity. She understood now what had been missing from her deliberations about the future. She had been focusing on the fear, on the trauma, on what might go wrong. But David had reminded her of what could go right, of why she had joined the military in the first place. She wanted to serve. She wanted to help people. She wanted to be there for others when they needed her most. That night, Sarah sat down with a pen and paper and wrote out her thoughts. She listed all the reasons to leave the military and all the reasons to stay. The list for leaving was long. The danger, the trauma, the physical toll, the separation from family, the constant stress. But the list for staying was simpler and somehow more powerful. Purpose, service, family, honor. Those 4 words captured everything that mattered to her. She thought about the silver star hanging on her wall, about what it represented. It was not just a medal for one moment of courage. It was a symbol of values she believed in, of a code she wanted to live by. She thought about Lieutenant Chen's words, that she had already given more than most. But she did not want to be someone who gave enough. She wanted to be someone who gave everything she had for as long as she could. The decision crystallized in that moment. She would re-enlist. She would continue to serve. But she would do it differently than before. She would take care of herself, would continue therapy, would acknowledge her limitations even as she pushed against them. She would be honest about her struggles with trauma, and would use her experience to help other soldiers who faced similar challenges. She would not pretend to be invincible. She would be human, flawed, and still committed to service. The next morning, Sarah walked into Lieutenant Chen's office and told him her decision. He studied her face for a long moment, searching for doubt or hesitation. When he found none, he nodded slowly and extended his hand. He told her the unit would be honored to have her back on active duty when she was ready. He also told her about a new position that had opened up, a role training combat medics and communication specialists on trauma response and crisis management. It would keep her stateside for a while, give her more time to heal while still allowing her to contribute meaningfully to the mission. Sarah accepted immediately. It felt right, like a path forward that honored both her need to serve and her need to recover. She would share her story with others, would teach them not just the technical skills they needed, but the mental resilience required to survive when everything went wrong. She would turn her trauma into something useful, something that could save lives in the future. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into preparation for her new role. She worked with Dr. Sawyer to develop training materials on psychological resilience. She consulted with medical experts on the best practices for treating combat injuries. She reached out to other veterans who had overcome similar challenges and learned from their experiences. The work was fulfilling in a way she had not expected, giving her a sense of purpose that went beyond her own recovery. Maria threw her a small celebration when the orders came through officially. It was just the core members of their unit, the people who had been there that day on the mountain road. They gathered in a private room at a local restaurant, sharing food and stories and the kind of easy camaraderie that only comes from shared hardship. Jake made a toast to Sarah, calling her the toughest communications specialist in the entire military. Everyone laughed and raised their glasses, but then Maria stood and made her own toast. She spoke quietly, her voice thick with emotion. She talked about courage and sacrifice, about the bonds that held soldiers together. She talked about how Sarah had run into fire when anyone else would have stayed in cover, how she had kept working despite her injuries, how she had put the mission and her teammates above her own safety. She said that Sarah was living proof that heroes were not born but made, forged in the crucible of impossible choices and sustained by a commitment to something greater than themselves. Sarah felt her throat tighten as Maria spoke. She looked around the table at these people who had become her family. They had seen her at her worst and at her best. They knew her fears and her strengths. They had bled with her, fought beside her, and survived together. This was why she was staying, not for glory or recognition, but for this, for the privilege of serving alongside people who... The training facility was buzzing with activity when Sarah arrived for her first day in the new role. Young soldiers filled the classrooms and training grounds, eager faces full of determination and innocence. Sarah recognized that look because she had worn it herself once. Before she learned what service really meant, before she understood the weight of the responsibility she was accepting. Her first class was a group of 20 communication specialists fresh out of basic training. They stood at attention when she entered, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Sarah told them to be at ease and take their seats. She looked at them for a moment, these young men and women who reminded her so much of herself 5 years ago. Then she began to speak, not from a script or a manual, but from her heart. She told them her story. Not all of it, not the darkest parts that still haunted her dreams, but enough. She told them about the ambush, about the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. She told them about the fear that had gripped her as she ran through enemy fire, about the pain of her injuries, about the satisfaction of knowing she had saved lives. She showed them her scars, visible proof that service came with a price. But she also told them about resilience, about the strength that comes from facing your worst fears and surviving. She talked about the importance of mental health, about seeking help when you need it, about the fact that admitting vulnerability takes more courage than pretending to be invincible. She watched their faces as she spoke and saw the understanding dawn. This was not the sanitized version of military service they might have expected. This was the truth, raw and unfiltered. After her presentation, several students approached with questions. A young woman named Emily asked how Sarah had found the courage to run into danger when every instinct must have been screaming at her to stay in cover. Sarah thought about the question carefully before answering. She told Emily that courage was not about being fearless. It was about deciding what mattered most and acting on that decision regardless of the cost. In that moment on the mountain road, her teammates had mattered more than her own safety. That was all the motivation she had needed. A young man named Marcus asked a harder question. He wanted to know if Sarah ever regretted her choice, if there were moments when she wished she had stayed in cover and let someone else take the risk. Sarah appreciated his honesty and gave him an honest answer in return. She told him that she sometimes wondered what would have happened if she had made a different choice, but she never regretted the one she made. Regret, she said, comes from betraying your values, not from upholding them. She could live with the scars and the nightmares because she could not have lived with herself if she had abandoned her teammates. Over the following months, Sarah settled into her new role. She taught classes on communication protocols, crisis management, and combat medicine. But more importantly, she taught about the human element of military service, about the bonds between soldiers, about the importance of taking care of each other. Her classes became known for their brutal honesty and practical wisdom. Students sought her out not just for technical knowledge, but for guidance on how to survive the psychological challenges of service. David Walsh came to visit one afternoon, walking into her office with a smile on his face. He looked healthier than the last time she had seen him, more confident in his movements. He told her he had enrolled in college and was studying psychology, hoping to one day help other veterans cope with combat trauma. Sarah felt a surge of pride. This was the man she had saved, using his second chance at life to help others. It validated everything she had been through. They talked about the ambush from their different perspectives. David had only fragmented memories of being pulled from the vehicle, disconnected images that did not form a coherent narrative, but he remembered Sarah's face above him, remembered the determination in her eyes. He told her that in his confused and injured state, she had seemed like an angel, a force of pure will that refused to let him die. Sarah laughed at the description, but David was serious. He said that hope could take many forms, and that day it had taken the form of a wounded communications specialist who refused to give up. Maria received orders for deployment overseas. The night before she left, she and Sarah met for dinner. They talked about their hopes and fears, about the missions ahead, about the uncertain future. Maria admitted she was nervous about going back into combat, that the memories of the ambush still affected her. But she also said she was ready, that she had learned from that experience and would be better prepared next time. Sarah told her to trust her instincts, to take care of herself, and to remember that asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness. As they said goodbye, Maria hugged Sarah tightly and whispered a thank you, not just for saving her life, but for showing her what real courage looked like. Sarah hugged back just as tightly and told Maria to stay safe. They both knew that every deployment carried risks, that there were no guarantees in their line of work. But they also knew they would face whatever came with the same determination that had carried them through the ambush. Jake received his promotion to sergeant and came to Sarah for advice on how to be a good leader. They sat in her office and Sarah shared the lessons she had learned. She told him that leadership was not about being the loudest voice or giving the most orders. It was about being willing to do what you asked others to do, about putting the mission and your people above yourself. She told him about Lieutenant Chen, about how his calm presence and clear thinking had helped them survive that terrible day. She said that the best leaders led by example, showing others through their actions what was possible. Sarah's own nightmares gradually became less frequent. The therapy was working, slowly rewiring her brain's response to trauma. She learned techniques for managing anxiety, for grounding herself when memories threatened to overwhelm her. She also learned to be gentle with herself, to accept that healing was not linear, that there would be good days and bad days. Dr. Sawyer helped her understand that she did not need to be perfect, that being human and flawed and still committed to growth was enough. One afternoon, Sarah received notification that she had been selected to speak at a conference on military leadership. The organizers had heard about her story and wanted her to share her insights with a wider audience. Sarah was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of being held up as an example, but she thought about all the young soldiers she had taught, about how sharing her story had helped them prepare for their own challenges. If speaking at this conference could help even a few more people, then she had an obligation to do it. The day of the conference, Sarah stood backstage, her heart pounding. She could hear the murmur of the crowd. Hundreds of military personnel gathered to learn about leadership in combat situations. She thought about walking away, about letting someone else take this spotlight. But then she remembered David's words about hope taking many forms. Maybe her story could be a form of hope for someone else, a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. She walked onto the stage and looked out at the audience. Then she began to speak, telling her story one more time. She talked about the ambush, about her injuries, about the decision to keep working despite the pain. She talked about the importance of mental health, about asking for help, about the bonds between soldiers, and she talked about why she had chosen to stay in the military, despite everything she had been through. She told them that service was about more than following orders or completing missions. It was about being part of something larger than yourself, about standing beside your fellow soldiers when the world fell apart. It was about making the hard choice to run toward danger when every instinct screamed at you to run away. It was about being willing to sacrifice for others because that was what family did. And every unit was a family bound together by shared purpose and mutual trust. When she finished, the audience stood and applauded. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of pride and gratitude. She had survived the worst day of her life and had turned that experience into something meaningful. She was using her pain to help others, to teach them, to inspire them. That was worth everything she had endured. After the conference, a young lieutenant approached Sarah. The woman told her that she had been considering leaving the military after a difficult deployment, that she was struggling with trauma and doubts. But hearing Sarah's story had reminded her why she had joined in the first place. She was going to stay, was going to seek help for her trauma, was going to give herself a chance to heal and continue serving. Sarah hugged this stranger who felt like a sister and told her to be strong, that the path forward would not be easy, but it would be worth it. That evening, Sarah stood in her apartment and looked at the silver star on her wall. She thought about the day she had received it, about how overwhelmed she had felt. But now she understood what the medal really meant. It was not about one moment of courage on a mountain road. It was about the choice to keep serving despite fear, despite pain, despite trauma. It was about deciding every day to be the person who runs toward danger when others need help. She thought about her future,